Hello and welcome back. Today I wanted to talk about politics in the Book of Mormon. Some things are easy to miss, but once you see them, they help make sense of seemingly random events. In general, the Book of Mormon was written from the viewpoint of the Nephites, a comparatively small group of people living in the Americas. And we may be tempted to think of the other groups, as my kids would say, as NPCs. Simply existing with no real purpose. But just because the narrator doesn't focus on them doesn't mean that they didn't have their own motives, their own leaders, goals, and so on. For example, the Lamanites are by far the largest group mentioned. Different regions of Lamanites were led by kings who all reported to a main king, if that's the right term. We see this when Ammon meets King Lamoni. Lamoni is king over his own people, but he's ultimately answerable to his father, who is king over all the land. As for the Lamanite religion, there really didn't seem to be one. All it says in a few places is that the Lamanites were idolatrous or that they worshipped idols. But that doesn't mean that Christianity and idolatry were the only religious choices available to the people of the New World. There was also the religion of Nehor. And Nehor was actively teaching long before we're introduced to him in Alma chapter 1. He was a religious leader who apparently lived among the Lamanites, but although he lived among the Lamanites, his religion never seemed to catch on with them. Most of his followers were Nephite dissenters, meaning people who had previously been Nephites, but who had chosen to leave. Religiously, the Nephites were under the law of Moses, and failing to comply with the law of Moses, or trying to persuade others to leave the law of Moses, carried severe penalties. So the religion of Nehor primarily grew among Nephite dissenters who had left their homeland to live among the Lamanites. Politically, the Nephites had a king, King Mosiah. Most of the Nephite dissenters appeared to follow a man named Amlici, and we'll talk about him in a second. But as with Nehor, Amlici's influence began long before Mormon introduces him in Alma chapters 2 and 3. His influence among the Lamanites can be a little harder to identify because of a typo or a misspelling by one of Joseph Smith's scribes while the Book of Mormon was being translated. The way the Book of Mormon is currently written, there appear to be two groups: the Amlicites, who appear in Alma chapters 2 and 3, and the Amalekites, who appear later in the Book of Alma. But according to Royal Skousen, a BYU professor who was tasked with studying Joseph's original handwritten manuscript of the Book of Mormon, insofar as it remains, the word Amalekite was a misspelling of Amlicite. The first time a name appeared, Joseph would spell it out a letter at a time, and thereafter he would just say the name and the scribe would just write it out. So between the first couple of chapters of Alma, where we're introduced to Amlici, and Alma 21, when we see the Amlicites or Amalekites, the scribe began spelling the name differently. So in short, the Amalekites were simply misspelled Amlicites. And so that's how I'll refer to them. With Amlicite misspelled as Amalekite later in Alma, the importance of Amlici's role is less obvious. Amlici was the political leader of many Nephite dissenters, and Amlici and his followers followed the religion of Nehor, and they all lived apparently peacefully among the Lamanites. We see the Amlicites' presence among the Lamanites when King Mosiah's sons went on their missions. That story begins with Ammon converting King Lamoni and his people in an area populated only by Lamanites called Ishmael. And then the narrator switched the focus to Ammon's brother Aaron. The city where Aaron went was called Jerusalem, and it had been built and was populated by a mixture of Lamanites, Amlicites, and Amulonites. The Amulonites were the descendants of King Noah's priests. Remember when King Noah's priests kidnapped and married several young Lamanite girls? Amulon was the name of the leader of King Noah's priests, and the descendants of those priests and the Lamanite girls, half Nephite and half Lamanite, were called Amulonites. Verses 2 through 4 of chapter 21 explain why Aaron's missionary efforts were so much less successful than Ammon's. Now the Lamanites and the Amlicites and the people of Amulon had built a great city, which was called Jerusalem. Now the Lamanites of themselves were sufficiently hardened, but the Amalekites and the Ammonites were still harder. Therefore they did cause the Lamanites that they should wax strong in wickedness and their abominations. And it came to pass that Aaron came to the city of Jerusalem and first began to preach to the Amalekites. And he began to preach to them in their synagogues, for they had built synagogues after the order of the Nehors. For many of the Amalekites and the Ammonites were after the order of the Nehors. So by the time Mosiah's sons went on their missions, the Amalekites had built several churches for Nehor and also built several cities. This was at least a year before Alma 1 when Nehor was introduced, and around 5 years before Amaleki attempted to overthrow the government in Alma chapter 2. Normally, when we read about Nehor in Alma chapter 1, we think that he was a random charismatic preacher that just showed up one day. But he already had followers living among the Lamanites who had built several churches. And it's the same with Amaleki. There were already enough Amalekites living among the Lamanites for them to have helped build a great city, like we talked about. And all of this was long before Alma chapter 2, when Amaleki attempted to overthrow Alma, the chief judge, and make himself king over the land. But then, there were changes that allowed Nehor and Amaleki to expand into the land of the Nephites. Shortly before King Mosiah died, he and Alma modified both the Nephite religion and also Nephite politics. First, in Mosiah 26, Alma had a revelation that introduced excommunication as an option for Nephites who no longer wished to be part of the church. Previously, exile was their only option. Since they were under the law of Moses, they couldn't remain there as non-believers. But now they could be excommunicated and continue to live with the Nephites. As it says in Mosiah 26:32, "The same shall not be numbered among my people." The use of the word number to me implies that someone was keeping an official tally. And as a sidebar comment, it seems that Alma the Younger and the sons of Mosiah may have been among those who chose to leave the church, perhaps not to join it, because when Mosiah 27:8 introduces us to them, the wording says that they were, quote, numbered among the unbelievers. It didn't just say they were among the unbelievers, but they were numbered among them. Before Alma received the revelation that allowed excommunication, if you didn't believe, you could either go along and pretend and practice the religion anyway, or you could leave. But now, you could live as a non-believer among the Nephites without having to pretend. You can see how that might change things. So after Alma announced this change and allowed non-believers to leave the church and still keep living where they lived, it opened the floodgates on all the years of pent-up resentment that the non-believers felt for having to follow the rules of a religion they didn't believe in. In Mosiah 27:1, right after the announcement, the persecution by those non-believers became so intense that the king had to get involved. But back to our topic, that change also meant that Nehor wasn't limited to preaching among the Lamanites anymore. He could now preach among the Nephites because they had the option to leave the church of God and follow him. A decade or so later, we'll read that an entire city, the city of Ammonihah, belonged to the church of Nehor. It doesn't indicate whether they started following him before or after Alma received that revelation, but within 10 years, at least one major city among the Nephites was following the religion of Nehor. The second major change, which we talked about in Mosiah 29, was the ending of the monarchy. Alma's son, Alma the Younger, and King Mosiah's sons had now joined the church and were numbered among the believers, but none of Mosiah's sons wanted to be the next king. And although Mosiah was still comparatively young, he was only 62 or 63 at the time, he seemed to know that he was about to die. In my video about this, someone left a comment pointing out that when Alma 1:1 refers to King Mosiah's death, it says that he had gone the way of all the earth, having warred a good warfare. So perhaps he spent his last few years fighting a terminal condition. Don't know for sure. In any case, he knew that death was coming and that none of his sons was willing to be king, and Mosiah was worried that his death would cause his kingdom to fall into chaos and that there would be fighting and bloodshed over who was going to replace him on the throne. So he ended the monarchy, and he instituted a form of democracy where the people would be governed by judges elected to office by popular vote. As Mosiah phrased it in chapter 29, verse 26, "Therefore this shall ye observe, and make it your law, to do your business by the voice of the people." So he ended the royal family and made everyone equal. And this made the people excited. As Mosiah 29:38 says, "Therefore they relinquished their desires for a king and became exceedingly anxious that every man should have an equal chance throughout all the land. Yea, and every man expressed a willingness to answer for his own sins." So those were the two big changes. Nephites could become non-believers without having to leave, and leaders were chosen by popular vote. And in the book of Alma, we see both of these changes having a big impact. The book of Alma begins with Nehor, the religious leader, traveling among the Nephites, visiting some of his followers and gaining some new ones, something that he probably hadn't been able to do before. As he traveled, he crossed paths with Gideon. Gideon used to be a soldier. He's the one who chased King Noah up a tower. But he was old and retired now and had become a teacher. He argued with Nehor. Nehor killed Gideon, and Alma enforced the law that said that murderers must be executed, and Nehor was put to death. Because of excommunication being allowed, the Nephites were starting to be divided into two groups, the believers and the non-believers. So when Nehor, who was the religious leader of many of the non-believers, was killed, it's not surprising that that division became even worse. And remember Amlici, the leader of the exiled Nephites? Now that anyone could be elected as a leader, he took advantage of the growing religious divide and began campaigning to the non-believers. Amlici promised that if he was made the leader, he would destroy the church of God. And you can see how this promise would be appealing to the people whose religious leader had just been killed. Christians killed your religious leader, you can get payback by destroying their religion. So the Nephites held an election to see whether Amlici would become the new king. The vote wasn't whether to make him a judge, but whether to get rid of the government altogether and crown Amlici as king. Well, Amlici lost the election, but he persuaded his followers to crown him as their king anyway. And then he and his followers attempted to conquer the Nephites by force. Now, don't forget that in addition to his Nephite followers, Amlici had a large number of ex-Nephite followers living among the Lamanites, and he was also friends with the Lamanites. So he coordinated an attack on the Nephites with the Lamanite king. Unfortunately for Amlici, I'm not sure if they misread their calendar or what, but the Lamanites arrived the day after Amlici's attack on the Nephites began. And on that first day, before the Lamanites joined the battle, the Nephites had already killed more than 12,000 Amlicites and defeated their army. And it wasn't until the next day that the surviving Amlicites were joined by the army of the Lamanites led by the Lamanite king. I say the Lamanite king, but as we discussed earlier, the Lamanites had several kings, and it seems that this was likely one of the lesser kings because, based on the timeline, Lamoni's father, who was the Lamanite king over all the land, had already been converted by this point. Anyway, Alma and the Nephite army defeated the Amlicite and Lamanite army and drove them from the land. But although they had won the battle, the Nephites had lost thousands and thousands of men. In addition, since they had been fighting on their own lands, many of their farms had been destroyed. So great were their afflictions, it says, that every soul had cause to mourn. It took them a few years to recover, and, quote, "They believed that it was the judgments of God sent upon them because of their wickedness and their abominations. Therefore they were awakened to a remembrance of their duty." A minute ago we talked about a growing division among the Nephites between believers and non-believers. After the battle with the Amlicites, the pendulum began to swing in the other direction. Thousands of non-believers joined the church and were baptized. The church expanded. The people prospered, and as they prospered, the people began to become proud. I'm not going to cover everything that happened, but Alma resigned as chief judge and started going from city to city to call his people to repentance or to bring them back to the path of righteousness. And he was very successful, except for one major city, and that's the city of Ammonihah. And that's the city I referenced earlier, where most of the people were now followers of Nehor's religion. Now, before we shift our focus back to the sons of Mosiah teaching among the Lamanites, let me recap. Nehor was a major religious leader. Amlici was a major political leader, and both of them were killed by Alma. Alma ordered the execution of Nehor, and he personally killed Amlici with the sword in battle. But at the time that the sons of Mosiah embarked on their missions, Nehor and Amlici were both still alive and well. Ammon went on his mission to the land of Ishmael, a part of the land that Nehor and Amlici's influence hadn't reached yet. He met and taught King Lamoni and most of the people there joined the church. Aaron, on the other hand, went to the city of Jerusalem, which, as we read earlier, was a city that had been jointly built by the Lamanites, Amlicites, and Ammonites, and that city had several Nehorite synagogues, if Nehorite is a word. So, unlike Ammon, Aaron and his brothers were rejected in their missionary efforts at Jerusalem, and also the other nearby cities where Nehor and Amlici had a strong influence. And Aaron and his brothers were thrown into prison. Ammon and Lamoni learned that Aaron and the others were in prison and went to release them. Along their way, they met Lamoni's father, who was the main king over the land, and long story short, when Lamoni's father met Ammon, he was so impressed with him that he wanted to be taught the gospel. So after Aaron was released from prison, he went to teach him. Lamoni's father was converted and ordered that King Mosiah's sons be allowed to teach throughout the land. The expanding influence of the Nephites didn't sit well with the Amlicites and with Nehor's other followers. Their dislike of the gospel was the reason they had left the Nephites in the first place. Thanks to the sons of Mosiah's missionary efforts, the gospel began to spread among the Lamanites, but only in a limited geographic area. Alma 23 lists the areas where the Lamanites were converted. The lands of Ishmael, Badoni, Nephi, Shilem, Shemlon, Lemuel, and Shimnalam. And that's about it. So while Mosiah's sons were teaching in that area, Alma 24 tells us that the Amlicites and Ammonites, basically the followers of Nehor, were working with the people in Amulon, Helam, Jerusalem, and all the land round about, trying to stir them up to anger against the Lamanites who had become converted. It doesn't say exactly what message they used to stir up the Lamanites against the converts. Maybe they warned them that several of their brethren were joining the Nephite religion, or maybe they pointed out that the main Lamanite king was now taking orders from the sons of the Nephite king. We don't know exactly what they said. Eventually, as you probably know, the Amlicites and Ammonites convinced the Lamanites to assemble a large army and to attack the Lamanite converts. The Lamanite converts, who had named themselves the anti-Nephi Lehites, had made a promise to never use weapons again and refused to fight back. So when the Lamanites arrived, it was a slaughter. But when the Lamanites realized what they were doing, that they were basically murdering their own people, they stopped killing. They laid down their weapons and even got down and laid down on the ground with the anti-Nephi Lehites. Alma 24 tells us that 1,005 Lamanites were slain. Now the greatest number of those of the Lamanites who slew so many of their brethren were Amlicites and Ammonites, the greatest number of whom were after the order of the Nehors. Skipping a couple of verses to Alma 25 verse 2, after the Lamanite army stopped killing the Lamanite converts, they went and destroyed the people in the city of Ammonihah. This was that same Nephite city I mentioned earlier where Alma's preaching had not been a success because most of the people belonged to Nehor's religion. In this city, Alma and Amulek were thrown into prison and all the believers were driven from the city, the men anyway, the women and children were burned to death. So it might be significant that after Nehor's followers convinced the Lamanites to kill 1,005 Lamanites, that the Lamanites retaliated by utterly destroying a city full of Nehor's followers. After they destroyed Ammonihah, the Lamanite army tried to continue attacking other Nephite cities, but they were driven back, and so many Ammonites were killed that after Alma 25, the Ammonites are never mentioned again. Roughly 4 years after the Lamanites and Amlicites first tried to kill the people of anti-Nephi Lehi, or the converts, they gathered a second army and prepared to attack again. They started killing, and this time the Lamanites knew that their victims would not fight back, and they were okay with it. Ammon and his brothers saw the danger that presented and called a meeting. They suggested that the Lamanite converts go down to Zarahemla for protection. But the king knew that the Nephites had recently been invaded twice by Lamanite armies. So when Ammon suggested they go to the Nephites, he said, "Behold, the Nephites will destroy us because of the many murders and sins we have committed against them." He said if the Lord wanted them to go, they would, but otherwise they would stay and die. Long story short, God said to go. So they gathered everything they had and walked down to the Nephite border. Ammon and his brothers continued onward to the capital of Zarahemla to ask the government if they'd be willing to accept these Lamanite refugees. As they traveled toward the capital, the sons of Mosiah met Alma the younger, who was still traveling throughout the land preaching to the people. He escorted them to the chief judge, and the chief judge called for a vote. Should they allow the Lamanite refugees to enter their lands or not? And I wonder how long this vote took, because the refugees were waiting on the borders of the land and the Lamanite armies were probably in pursuit. But the Nephites said they were not only willing to let the Lamanites come into their lands, but they'd give them a place to live, the land of Jershon. And since the new Lamanite converts had sworn to no longer take up arms, the Nephite armies would protect them from the attacking Lamanite armies. In my opinion, the reason the Nephites were so welcoming and generous was thanks to Alma's ministry among them. And the only city that might have voted against helping the new converts, the city of Ammonihah, had been destroyed by the Lamanites. The converts moved to Jershon. The Lamanite armies invaded. The Nephite armies defeated the Lamanites in a massive battle that drove them back to their own lands. So, to recap, laws changed so that people could believe whatever they wanted, and anyone could be king. This allowed Nehor's religion to spread among the Nephites instead of just among the Lamanites, and it allowed Amlici to try to be elected king. Although Nehor was executed and Amlici died in battle, their anti-Christian teachings remained. Alma resigned as chief judge and began a mission to restore the Nephites to Christianity, and he succeeded. Other than in the city of Ammonihah, but the Lamanite army that intended to kill the Lamanite converts came north and destroyed that city of Ammonihah. So when the Lamanites attacked the anti-Nephi Lehites again and they asked the Nephites for help escaping the Lamanites, the Nephites welcomed them with open arms. My goal in making this video was to help the events in the book of Alma to make more sense. So instead of it seeming like a series of random people and random events and random things, you'd see it more as a continuous, cohesive narrative. Hopefully this was helpful. Let me know. Was it helpful or did it make things more confusing? Let me know in the comments. And we will see you next time.